Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here, and we have an online audience as well. Do I need to do anything to check that the online audience can hear, or do we just assume that they're there? Perfect. Well, a very warm welcome to you all. It's wonderful to be back in person for the Verrall Lecture, and I hope that many of you, if not all of you, are able to stay for the Verrall supper afterwards. I'm Helen Roy, and I'm the past president of the Royal Entomological Society and a current trustee of the Royal Entomological Society. And I'm delighted today to have the honor of introducing Ed to you all, and I'm doing so as well on behalf of Jane, and I'm sure you've all met Jane Hill, who is the current president and was expecting to be a little later, so I'm just explaining why I'm here and not Jane. While you get, I feel like you're shortchanged, but it's fine, we'll go with it. And it's wonderful to see so many people here, and also from around the world online, and I think I'm already violating the things by stepping away from the microphone. I hope that many of you are already members or fellows of the Royal Entomological Society. It is a really wonderful society to be part of. I've been a member since I was a PhD student a long time ago and have gained so much from my involvement with the society. And if you want to chat about anything to do with the society, don't hesitate to come and have a chat to me. I'll be very happy to advertise the society to you. And if you're a student, it's free for you. So get online and join soon. That will be wonderful. So we're going to have a very fun evening and a great time hearing from Ed, but there's just a few announcements that I have to give. I'm going to read out the ones that are actually the ones to do with health and safety. So if you're in the room, you have to familiarize yourself with the nearest fire exits lit up by the green signs. And at the front and the back, there's no planned fire drills. So if we hear an alarm, we have to make our way back down the stairs and outside to Exhibition Road. But I would imagine that, for example, Luke will lead the way and we will all follow. So that's the default. So for those of you who are online, welcome to you all, and I hope you feel included in the activities this afternoon. Please keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off throughout. This helps with bandwidth. But if you would like to ask some questions online, please use the Q&A function and we'll definitely come to your questions. So Fran and Luke from the Royal Entomological Society are going to help me at the end in terms of chairing those questions, and everyone online is very, very welcome to join with that. I also just want to mention that there's a lot going on within the Royal Entomological Society at the moment, and a lot of exciting activities that you could take part in over the, oh, right, slide. Great, there we are. Ta-da. The slides. So we'll skip straight to them. It's really wonderful now that we have this tradition of linking up with the Amateur Entomologists Society to have the Young Verrall Lecture. And it's particularly exciting because this year there'll be an in-person element, and Ed is going to be traveling up to Staffordshire to the Invertebrate Fair, and there'll also be an opportunity for people to join online as well. And don't think it is just for the young. If you wish to join the Young Verralls, you're very, very welcome. Not implying you're not young. You'd be very welcome. I've been for a few years and it's really, really great. But it is particularly aimed at those aged 11 to 14. And I was just chatting to Ed over coffee, and he has really exciting plans for the Young Verrall. So those of you able to attend are in for a real treat. I might even say even more so than we're going to have this afternoon, and we're going to have an amazing time this afternoon, but the Young Verrall is going to be really fantastic. The student forum is coming up at the end of March. It is fully booked for in-person participation, but if anyone would like to join online, they'd be most welcome to register. Again, a really fantastic event to be part of. And then on the 5th of April, there's going to be an online talk from Professor Arnold van Hoos from the University of Wageningen, and he's going to be talking about edible insects, progress and prospects. We covered, oh no, and then we have the RHS Chelsea Flower Show, which I think maybe you have read about or heard about through the news. It's very exciting that the Royal Entomological Society will be there. That was supposed to be my final thing that I mentioned. I have to go back now to two other things. There is online registration available for ENTO. So ENTO at the end in September, and early bird registration for that. It will be down in Falmouth at the University of Exeter campus there. And for those of you who were at Lincoln last year, I think you'll all agree it was a really fantastic event. And I really encourage you to come along to ENTO down in Cornwall. And thank you to the Royal ENSOC for such a wonderful event over in Lincoln. It really was great. I think there's just one final thing that I have. The insect behavior special interest group on the 26th of April is also going to be online. So you're all welcome. I think I have been through the activities, but do check the Royal Entomological Society website to check on the latest plans of what you can take part in. That's all the announcement. Ed's probably thinking, when are we actually going to get to the Verrall Lecture? We're now going to get to the Verrall Lecture. So it's really my absolute pleasure to be introducing Ed Turner today to give us the Verrall Lecture. And I've had the pleasure now of meeting Ed a few times and hearing about his enthusiasm for science communication and the wonderful work that he's been doing in the museum at Cambridge University. He's an associate professor, curator of insects at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, and he's a fellow and tutor for Access and Outreach at Clare College, Cambridge. He's a conservation scientist, and he researches strategies to conserve species diversity and healthy ecosystem functioning, both in the UK, but around the world as well. And his work has included investigating biodiversity of oil palm plantations in Sumatra, Indonesia, and on a whole variety of different programs. He's been investigating the impact of rainforest fragmentation and collaborating with the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust back in the UK, and investigating insect diversity and management on chalk grassland reserves. And today, Ed's going to be talking to us about tropical ecosystems and the astonishing variety of insect life that they contain, and how the threats from logging, agricultural expansion, and the impacts of climate change are affecting their diversity. So please join me in welcoming Ed to the stage and looking forward very much to your Verrall Lecture.
I brought a clock so I don't go over time.
I think I've really got it.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here and be giving this talk, and thank you very much to Helen for very kind words. It's a real honour to do this, and it's really nice to see so many friendly faces here and back in person again for this lecture as well, which is absolutely lovely. To give this talk, I was thinking about kind of why I was interested in insects, I suppose, and I think probably like most people in the audience and online as well, I've always been completely fascinated by insects. I think they're one of those things, they're endlessly fascinating, as of course is the rest of the natural world as well. There's an endless variety of things you can find out about insects just by watching them or by recording them. And you can do that, of course, in any environment with insects because they really are everywhere. I think that's an amazing thing about them. But like many other things in the natural world, of course, there are lots of challenges now facing insects. And I guess that's why I wanted to do my talk related to insect conservation, or indeed why I've been focused on insect conservation for my research and all the collaboration we've been doing over the last, 20 years or so. You're probably all aware of the challenges better than I am, but of course the central one is that we're living in an increasingly human-dominated world and an increasingly demanding human-dominated world. We're wanting more and more food per person, number one driver of habitat change worldwide. If we were to kind of do the maths here, we might expect a 70 to over 100% increase in food demand by 2050. It's an enormous amount. If the same amount of production sticks as the kind of 1960 to 2000 levels, we'll be looking at somewhere in the region of 1 billion extra hectares of agricultural land worldwide. Of course, that hopefully won't happen. What we're also doing is increasing production per area, but that's two different things which can impact insect numbers or increase indeed a whole of biodiversity worldwide. And because, of course, it means there's less and less space for insects. You can see this in the bottom here. This is a recent paper by Pottebev and colleagues looking at the increase in cropland in green worldwide. I can do the mouse, can't I? I'm going to do the mouse, not point. Up here. So an increase in cropland, which is continuing to happen. And of course, this is driving changes in insects. The NPP at the bottom here is about increasing crop production per area. Both of these things, of course, can be impacting insects as well. And of course, in line with all of this habitat change, this change in structure, which can be really important for insects, we've also got the overarching impacts of climate change. You had the wonderful Camille Parmesan talking last year, and I'd recommend everyone looking at her online talk, which is fantastic from this time last year, talking about the impacts of climate change just after the latest IPCC report. And it's pretty clear we're living in an increasingly warm and an increasingly variable world. Of course, these things can impact insects as well. Some ideas this might be more severe in the tropics, where insect diversity is highest, but recent publications saying that maybe this is also going to be equally severe in temperate regions, particularly because of the changes in climate when insects are active. These are really, really important factors, affecting insects worldwide, no matter what habitat you're in, whether you're in an agricultural area or whether you're in a pristine primary rainforest. And of course, there's predictions now about changes in biodiversity worldwide in line with these increases in temperature. This is all pulled from the IPCC report from last year. Well worth a read, although it's quite a depressing read. Watch a rom-com afterwards or something like that. So it's perhaps not surprising that when we start looking at these global data sets, again, loads of really nice synthesis papers coming out. This is the one by Van Klink et al. From Science a few years ago, looking at global population changes in insects. What we're seeing is, for terrestrial insects, a decrease of about 9% per decade in terms of abundance, really catastrophic. Interestingly, they're seeing an increase about the same amount in freshwater ecosystems. And one of the likely reasons for this is because we see here with this figure with the locations of these long-term studies worldwide, some of the very longest term studies, of course, here in the UK, they're dominated by the northern United States and by Europe, where, of course, we've seen rapid agricultural expansion has already happened, and perhaps our waterways are getting a little bit cleaner. That's one of the reasons why there's a difference between the terrestrial trends and the freshwater trends. But this unequal recording is a real issue because, of course, these trends are dominated by temperate regions where insect diversity is much, much less than the tropics. We've also been looking at this global trend in our group as well. This is a nice a plot just at the bottom here, recently produced by one of the members of our group who's here today, Esme Ash-Jepson, who's been looking at global studies, looking at effects of temperature on butterflies worldwide. So it's a way of thinking about the impacts, studies which have been looking at the impacts of climate change on insects. What she's found is a rapid increase in publications looking at temperature on insects, or butterflies in particular, worldwide. What we've got here in blue is the temperate regions. And hopefully what you can see is the number of studies has shot up, really increased dramatically for temperate regions, not so for tropical regions. So this bias seems to be true in terms of long-term insect numbers. It's also true in terms of studies looking particularly at climate change. So there's all sorts of things going on, perhaps not surprising that insect numbers are going down. And of course, this matters. I'm preaching very much to the converted here. Insects really are the little things that run the world. They're important because they're beautiful, because they're diverse, because they're endlessly fascinating. They're also important because of what they do. You can see this here worldwide. We know they underpin a lot of these important ecosystem functions. I've chosen pollination here just as an example of this. And this is work by Jeff Ollerton and colleagues looking at the proportion of plants in different regions of the world which are pollinated by animals, by insects mostly. And what you can see here is the proportion is increasing as you go towards the tropics. The most diverse places might be relying on these animal pollinators more than any other regions, but of course they're important in any ecosystem. And that's not just true of tropical, natural ecosystems. It's also true of human-dominated ecosystems as well. It's true of agricultural areas. Again, another beautiful global study here, synthesizing results, the map at the bottom here, and by Garibaldi et al., looking at 41 different crop systems worldwide. All of the different pie charts on that map are where the studies were based. So again, you can kind of see they're not, lots not in the tropics, in fact, but right on the edge. But unfocus your eyes and have a look at the colors here. What we've got is wild insects pollinating these crops in, I'm slightly colorblind, but I'm going to go for pink, and honeybees in green, which I'm pretty confident about. Great. Hopefully if you unfocus your eyes, you can see that once you go towards the tropics, it seems to be that, again, these wild insects are increasingly important for our own agricultural systems as well. So lose these insects, and of course, we're going to be losing a whole suite of different important ecosystem functions that we rely on every day as our daily food. So bring all this together, and it's pretty clear we need to be thinking about how we manage landscapes in much more detail, and particularly in relation to how insects work and things that affect insect abundance and diversity. We're going to be asking more and more of these agricultural systems as time goes on. We need to be managing them to protect as much biodiversity as possible. And we also need to be preserving the ecosystem functions and services make sure they're maintained in these human-dominated systems as well. That's absolutely key. And to do that, I think we need probably three main things. We need to understand the effects of change in detail, understand exactly what's driving a loss of species as you move from more pristine to more disturbed ecosystems. We also need to understand how best to manage these agricultural systems. I've put sustainably, which is quite a sort of catch-all term really, but to try and minimize the detrimental impacts is what I mean long term. And I think I've had an extra thing. I think we need to be engaging industry. We need to be engaging the wider community in this work, because without that, it's going to fail. It's really hard to do this research without that engagement, but also it's much, much harder to get impact from it. And what I'm going to try and do in my talk is then think about how we've been doing that in our own group, in our own little way. But mostly, again, it's relying on collaboration. You'll see all of the work I talk about is related to engagement with non-academic audiences. That's absolutely key. It underpins all of the work we've been doing. It's sort of collaborative in that way. Most of our work in the tropics is focused on this crop here, which is oil palm, which we try and use as a model system. Everyone's heard of oil palm. You've probably all had oil palm at some point today. Probably lots of you actually in the snacks and things outside. It's absolutely everywhere. It's the #1 source of vegetable oil worldwide nowadays. 72 million tons of palm oil produced in 2018, according to the FAO, so eye-watering amounts, with nearly all of this production being focused in Malaysia and Indonesia, the two major producers. But this production is going up worldwide now. It's something which is really being found everywhere. And a large part of that expansion has come at the direct expense of tropical rainforests, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, where there's good data on this. You can sort of see the changeover. That's kind of shown in the bottom here, where we're looking at the forest cover in green, going down in Indonesia in particular here, and the palm oil production going up. These two things are going hand in hand. But palm oil is also part of the solution here as well. It's by far the most productive vegetable oil crop we've got worldwide, 5 or 6 times more productive than any other major crop. And the other thing I think I'd flag about it is that it's got quite a robust, sustainability guidelines as well. The Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, so an accreditation body, which has got, it's not perfect, but again, it's got principles and criteria in place, which researchers, which management can directly inform as a framework where you can enact real change. So it's promising from that point of view. The other thing, you can see a little slice of what oil palm looks like here with some recently gathered, this is palm fruit bunches on the bottom in a mature plantation. These are plantations that can live 25 or 30 years before they're replanted. It's a perennial crop. So there's also quite a lot of chance for diversity of complexity to develop within these systems over that time. And that gives us a lot of scope for changing management, for changing the way these crops are run to try and increase biodiversity and associated ecosystem processes alongside that. And again, that's what we've been mostly trying to do within our group, to try and increase diversity a little bit. There's also a good database available for oil palm, thinking about the impacts that it's had. So we're not going into this completely blind. Again, there's some really nice work from Valentine Rees-Woolever, who is in the audience as well. Give a wave, Valentine. Who did this literary review. One of the benefits, I think, from COVID is having a chance to actually plunge into the literature for those couple of years when we were restricted in lots of other ways. And what Valentine was able to do was systematically search the literature to find out all that had been found out about oil palms. She set up a systematic map to do that. And what we found was that the number of publications in oil palm has gone up dramatically. And with a large chunk of those being based in Southeast Asia, that was really useful because, of course, it means we've got a good database to base our work on. But the other thing we were able to find out was areas where there hadn't been so much work. So really comprehensive data now looking at the impacts of habitat change, conversion to oil palm plantation, much less going through looking at how individual interventions can be used in an oil palm system to try and increase diversity. So an opportunity there to try and change or inform management to change the way that oil palm is managed, or as a case study, tropical crop. So what I'm going to try and do then over the next probably 40 minutes or so is introduce you to 3 different projects that our group's been involved with. It's just trying to do just that. And the first is the Mighty Stability Vaulted Forest Ecosystem Project, which is run out of Imperial and also Southeast Asian Rainforest Research Partnership, and really the brainchild of Rob Ewers, who a lot of you will know. This is a habitat change project. It's a gradient from primary forest all the way through to oil palm plantation with an experiment nested in it as well. The second is the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function in Tropical Agriculture project. This is one we've set up from Cambridge, but also in partnership with the oil palm industry with an organisation called Smart Tree, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later, where we've been looking at the impacts of changing understory management in established oil palm to follow that through to impacts on biodiversity, ecosystem functions, all the way through to yields. And then the third one is the RERTA project, Riparian Ecosystem Restoration in Tropical Agriculture project, which again is the same partnership. It's Cambridge again, but with Smart Tree, where we're aiming to restore river margins in oil palm systems. You'll notice all of these have got acronyms. As you're all aware, you have to have an acronym to get any research funding these days. So these are our 3 acronyms. For the BEFTA project, we were hoping we could have BEFTA awards for the best collaborators. This sort of tracks, in a way, my focus of research actually over the last 15 years or so. I've moved away from studies which have looked at the impacts of habitat change through to how you can manage agricultural systems through more recently to restoration. I think that interestingly, that tracks the direction I think ecology has been going as well. Indeed, probably lots of entomology too. We're in the UN decade of restoration. Now's the time to restore stuff. So let's go through these first then. So Stability Altered Forest Ecosystems Project, looking at that habitat change gradient. And this is a project which has really relied on collaboration. It's based in Sabah in Malaysia, tropical Malaysian Borneo. It's an enormous project which includes primary forest sites, which are OG here, in Maliau Basin, and also some reference sites in beautiful Danam Valley as well. Logged forest sites, which are maintained as log forest, and then through to the safe experimental area here. About 8,000 hectares, of which is very logged forest, in which patches of more pristine forest have been left as fragments, and then through to oil palm plantation. And again, this is a project which relies on collaboration. Enormous number of people have worked on this. So I've looked at the SAFE website this morning, and apparently it's 229 projects, 495 researchers, and 328 outputs. This again, which I think is mostly publications. This is again illustrating, I think, how this tropical research is changing. Its collaboration is really at the base of this. And that's across whole groups of academic organizations, about 50 plus countries involved, I believe now, including quite a few people in the audience here, I know. But also, importantly, the oil palm industry. So getting the industry involved at this point means that these outputs can have real impact in terms of changing management. I'm going to flick through for all of the projects. I wanted to give you a few key outputs, things that we've been finding out about the project, and particularly related to insects. And one of the things, I suppose, which is most important for insects is thinking about and itemizing exactly how structure changes when you convert a rainforest or you log a rainforest, you turn it into an oil palm plantation, what happens? The logging process itself, unsurprisingly, has really big impacts on the physical environment. That's shown quite nicely here. This is a paper led by Mariam Pfeiffer. And what we were looking at here was long-term forest plots. And we mapped out all of these different forest trees, and we looked at the number of living trees and the proportion of carbon in that part of the ecosystem compared to deadwood, and compared it across these different this habitat change gradient. That's what you can see here. So the proportion of carbon in live trees, perhaps not surprisingly, you log it and it goes down. Interestingly, the same isn't true for the deadwood. That's part of the habitat that kind of stays there. And so if you look at the change across the gradient, what you find is that as things become more disturbed, the importance of dead wood for carbon storage goes up. And that's interesting from a climate change point of view, from a carbon storage point of view. It's also interesting from an insect point of view, because it suggests that these habitats might become increasingly important for insects in more disturbed habitats. It also illustrates the change in the environment that happens when forest gets logged, when it gets disturbed. And that is the big trees kind of disappear. The structure above you, that rich diversity of structure, which lots of insects rely on, disappears as well. One of the things that means is the temperature changes completely. This is, again, really nice work from Stephen Hardwick and colleagues, which involved putting out thousands of these tiny little i-button data loggers across the whole safe experimental landscape. And what he's looking at here is temperature profile over the course of the day, both as air temperature, soil temperature, and also humidity, relative humidity here as percentage on the right-hand side. And what we've got is oil palm in grey, primary forest in red, and log forest in blue. I'm more confident about the colours here. Now, I'm not going to, it's not really sort of, I won't tell nature to hold the front page. It gets hotter during the day. Sounds surprising. But the interesting thing here is that it gets far, far hotter in the oil palm habitat. So what are we talking about? 4 or 5 degrees hotter during the heat of the day. That's a really big impact. And you can see that in the soil as well. So this isn't just the air, it's the soil temperature too. And almost the mirror image of this is for the relative humidity. It's much, much drier. One of the things that's really clear is for small organisms, things like insects, this is going to be a major challenge. This is a far bigger impact than we might be predicting from the impacts of climate change over the next 100 years. This is something that can happen to insects immediately as soon as the habitat's converted. So this can be really important. And one of the things that this collaborative project, this is the worst figure I'm going to introduce today. But one of the things the collaborative project can do, like SAFE, is bring together work from a huge number of researchers. So this is a paper that was led by Rob Ewers a few years ago, bringing together lots of work across the whole SAFE landscape, comparing the impacts of forest for a whole range of different organisms and the environment as well. So it's got the environment on the top, invertebrate abundance and diversity, and mass as well in some cases, and then vertebrate diversity and mass at the bottom here. We won't worry about those. We're interested in insects here. So this section here, again, I don't expect you to read all of these different names, but part of the point is, if you've got a large scale collaborative project like this, you can measure an awful lot of stuff. You can really begin to understand how a whole ecosystem is changing. That's really valuable in its own right. The other thing I want you to do is just kind of, again, unfocus your eyes and look at the dark green and orange, where hopefully what you can see is the response comparing dark green and orange for different groups, or indeed different aspects of the environment, are quite different. Some groups are really severely affected, others aren't. And that kind of depends on what they're doing in the ecosystem, perhaps how diverse they are, perhaps how robust those different groups are. I'm going to pick out a couple of interesting ones where there's differences in how susceptible they are to the impacts of logging. So in particular, this is one of my favorite ones here. These are marasmoid fungi. I don't know if you've seen these. This is actually a figure from some work from a colleague of mine, Jake Snadden, from a few years ago. But these are really amazing things in tropical rainforests. If you walk through a rainforest, pretty much wherever you are in the world, and if you've got slightly long hair like me, you'll quickly find you get your hair kind of gets tangled. I don't know why I did that. Your hair gets tangled with these accumulations of fungi, which are like hairs growing through the understory. Really interesting. It's something I've been walking through rainforests, not continuously, for about 10 years before I really noticed these. And it was Jake that pointed out what these were. And he realized that these were doing a really interesting thing in the system, in that they were catching leaf litter. Jake refers to this as fungal piracy. What they're doing is basically catching the leaf litter before it gets to the forest floor, and they're decomposing it there. And this is an example of that amazing complexity you can get in a rainforest ecosystem. One of the things Jake did was basically experimentally remove these systems and look at the impact on the number of insect species or invertebrate species generally found in the system. What he found was basically where you remove the fungi, the number of insects drops down. They're providing a novel habitat, and they're increasing the diversity in rainforests. Interestingly, we also looked at the number of these hyphae per area across the SAFE project, from pristine here on the left-hand side through to oil palm plantations, where they're still found actually, but they're right down in the understory. And hopefully you can, the kind of graph speaks for itself really. This is another component, this is an aspect of diversity that disappears when forest is converted or disturbed and converted through to log forest and ultimately to oil palm plantation. Another groups I wanted to focus on here are the all-important social insects, the ants and the termites, where you get quite contrasting and interestingly different results. See a huge drop in terms of the abundance and the biomass of termites, much less so for ants. But there are still lots of changes going on. So again, this is work from Sarah Luke, and when she was looking across the SAFE project here. And what she's looking at here is ants on the top and termites on the bottom. Again, looking at old growth forest, log forest, and oil palm plantation on the right. And you see the number of ants are more or less maintained. These are still ant-dominated systems, but the colours here represent different functional types of ants. Again, those are changing. So we're getting high numbers of things, but they're doing very different things in the ecosystem. So big changes in terms of the ecosystem function. In termites, it's much more catastrophic. These are things which are really sensitive to lots of these changes. And in particular, these again, different functional groups of termites. The only one you really need to worry about here is group 3, which are dead wood feeding termites and soil feeding termites, which drop right off as you go down from old growth forest to log forest. There are certain bits of this ecosystem which are basically dropping out. They're much, much more sensitive to habitat change. To put all of that together, and we can begin to look at how that affects how the whole ecosystem works. Again, summary paper here led by Rob. And what we're looking at here is now testing it. This is a whole set of experiments which excluded insects and also other groups to look at the impacts on key aspects of ecosystem functioning. And in particular here, we're looking at litter decomposition, seed removal, and also predation, mealworms. What happened here was, I think, had a set of students who were tying mealworms on little bits of thread and then seeing how quickly they're eaten by ants. And it turns out quite quickly. But one of the things we're able to do here was exclude insects and other groups or not, and look at how much that ecosystem function dropped. That's the idea behind this. So we've got here is the bit here I want you to focus on is where the little insect or little ant has got a cross through it. That's where it's been removed. And if you look, comparing again primary forest to log forest, compared to the sort of the drop, what we can sort of see is that across the board, if you exclude insects, you're getting really quite a big drop in terms of these ecosystem functions. So insects are important for all three of these processes, but the drop is consistently higher in the primary forest than it is in the log forest. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the proportional importance of insects is going down as forests become degraded, probably for all of these different reasons. So again, a strength of this project is you can begin to understand how this whole ecosystem is working, which groups are being impacted, and how that's playing through to ecosystem function. We also had a look at some aspects, not just in the terrestrial ecosystem, but in the freshwater ecosystem as well. So the whole series, as well as these different plots across land in this project, there's also a whole series of experimental rivers, which includes rivers right the way through into oil palm plantation, but also rivers in oil palm where forest areas have been left, so-called forest buffers. And there's some really interesting sort of trends. There's not huge replicate in this, but some really interesting trends, which I think informs management in agricultural systems within these areas as well. So this is really nice. There's new work just being put together, again, based on data collection from Sarah Luke and Martina Harianja from our group here, where she's looking at this lovely group of insects, these geromorpha bugs, these surface-dwelling bugs, which are really common in the streams you get in the safe landscape and across Southeast Asia as well. Quite a diversity of different major groups here, quite a diversity of different species. And one of the things that Martina was looking at here is catchment PC1 is just an index of how disturbed the catchment is. So as you go further to the left, to the right, it's less disturbed, something to bear in mind. And what she found was there's quite a dramatic drop as you begin to disturb an environment, as this forest becomes more disturbed. There's quite a dramatic drop in terms of the abundance and also the species richness of these bugs, which is really interesting. So these seem to, again, be something which is particularly sensitive to changes, very likely because they live on the water surface. Any sort of surfactants, anything like that is going to really impact them. Quite interesting. But then the other thing we did was look at those rivers within agricultural systems which had these buffers around it, which is OPB here, so oil palm with a river buffer. We looked at this as work from Sarah Luke on the top and Martina on the bottom, and we looked at this across this habitat gradient. And one of the things we found was that where you've got the buffer here, this bar, compared to oil palm with no buffer, you end up getting a far more rainforest-ish community. This is in terms of dragonflies on the top. So in particular, you've got certain groups like these beautiful euphea, which completely disappear if you haven't got a river buffer, but they're present if you keep the forest there. These aren't huge kind of pristine forest areas, about 50 meters buffers on each side of the river. We found similar pattern, interestingly, with the geromorpha bugs as well, where the abundance is much higher, where you've got this buffer present in the environment, and also certain groups, sensitive groups, being maintained where you've got the river system around. So again, hints there at how you could begin to manage these agricultural ecosystems to reduce some of these negative impacts. So it's learning from the habitat change gradient to try and think about how tropical agricultural systems could be managed more generally. And what we're trying to do with the second project, my second acronym, BEFTA, the Understory Vegetation Project, is to think about applying some of those lessons in an agricultural system, and in particular in oil palm. And the thing we were particularly interested in oil palm was the understory, because there can be hugely variable understory management. Everything from basically completely sprayed with herbicides through to something that resembles a secondary forest. It's amazingly variable particularly across smallholder systems. And one of the things we were able to do was partner with the oil palm industry to have a look at this. We partnered particularly with Smart Agro-Business and Food, so Research Institute, Smart Tree Research Institute, which is a research institute of a major oil palm producer. What we basically did was, working with them, we got them to change their management on replicated plots across their landscape in Sumatra and Indonesia. Now, I mentioned that Southeast Asia has got the highest levels of palm oil palm production in the world. If you were to put a pin in the area that's got the highest level of oil palm anywhere in the world, I suspect it would land in our study plots. These are basically oil palm century. It's oil palm as far as the eye can see, major industrial landscape. So we wanted to start there, and the reason we wanted to start there was because this is more or less the most extreme that tropical agriculture can get. There's no forest left, nothing like that. And what we did was set up a whole series of replicated plots, which are what is shown in yellow here. And if you can see, they're kind of based on different triplets. So 3 little plots together. And if I zoom in on one of those triplets, what you can see is what the plots actually look like here. So they're quite large. They're 150 meters by 150 meters. And what we did was a before-after controlled investigation. So we set up these plots, first of all, in areas which are very homogeneous. They're right next door to each other. You're not seeing triple. I'm just illustrating this. The habitat was exactly the same before we set up the project, which in this case was intermediate levels of herbicide spraying. They used to spray around the oil palms along access paths, but let out that vegetation grow up. And then what we did was collect loads of data, rather similar to the SAFE project. It was highly collaborative. So we had people coming in, we measured loads of stuff on insects, lots of ecosystem functions. We looked at soil erosion, we looked at larger animals as well, birds surveys, all kinds of things. And then after a year of that, we changed the management at random. So one each of these different treatments in these 3 replica blocks, which was either removal of all vegetation, so blanket herbicide spraying, which is what, again, lots of plantations do within these plots, business as usual, keeping it the same, or stopping herbicide spraying entirely, letting the vegetation grow up. And we monitored that for several more years. So it was a full-scale, large experiment to basically look at the impacts of management within these agricultural systems on insects and indeed the rest of the agricultural ecosystem. I'm going to give you some overview results, the kind of things we found. And again, what we were really expecting was once you've got this higher complexity, we might be seeing higher levels of biodiversity, higher levels of associated ecosystem processes as a result of this. And that's really what we found. In terms of our kind of findings, one of the things that was surprising to me, I'd done lots of work in oil palm before, but it was mostly across in Malaysian side, where I think understory management on the whole tends to be a little bit more severe. But I was really surprised at the level of diversity we had in our plots. Then these aren't green deserts. They're not forests, certainly not, much lower diversity than forests. But there's still lots of things living in these systems, which are potentially doing quite important things as far as ecosystem function, as far as processes within oil palm landscapes are concerned. So just an example here, we found 46 species of dragonflies just within our plots. So those 150 meter plots replicated 18 times. It's really quite high diversity. 3 new records for Sumatra, although significantly no endemic species to Sumatra. So these are really wider habitat species, but still quite a diverse community for an agricultural system. In terms of the effects of the treatment, well, it's kind of unsurprising. If you spray herbicide all over the vegetation, the complexity drops. But it shows the treatment's worked. And that's what's shown here. So in red, we've got the reduced treatment, enhanced is green, and then normal in blue. As we had the vegetation height dropping off, we had certain different parameters responding as you might expect. So fern cover going up, other plants going up even more in the enhanced treatment compared to the normal treatment. So the system changed. It became more diverse where you didn't spray. It became less diverse where you did spray more. We also found there was impacts on this on the local environment as well. So we also put out hundreds of little data loggers, which we burrowed in the soil. We tried to put them in the main landscape, but they disappeared very quickly. I found people that used them as key fobs, so they disappeared. So we buried the data loggers. And we were able to find there was lots of impacts in terms of the temperature as well. Overall, the average temperature over a day doesn't change between the treatments, but where we got the effect was in the heat of the day, in the afternoon, the hottest points of the day, where even in the soil, it was about 0.5 degrees warmer in the reduced treatments and the other things. So again, remembering that and linking it back to the impacts of rainforest stuff, there's stuff you can do in agricultural systems to reduce some of the impacts in terms of warming of this change. And we also found a whole series of different changes with regards to the biodiversity, the species found within these agricultural systems as a result of changing these management practices. This is again some more data from Andreas Advento here and Valentine, who I mentioned before. I'm looking at the abundance and richness of butterflies. There's quite a diverse community about, again, I think 70-ish species of butterfly that we found within these plantations. We're looking here pre-treatment and post-treatment for the reduced, normal, enhanced, again, the same color codes as before. And hopefully, again, unfocus your eyes, and what you can see is the number of butterflies and the richness, the number of species of these butterflies drops when the understory goes down. So again, increasing the diversity of the understory can really benefit this quite important group. We also found the same thing for whole suites of predatory species. And this is really nice data. Again, so this is data that's been analysed by Jake Stone, another member of our group. And again, we're looking here pre and post, with the red being the reduced treatments for 2 really nice species of assassin bug. And this is Cosmolestes on the top and Sicanus on the bottom here. These are known to be really important pest control agents in oil palm. And you can see post-treatment, they just drop right down. They basically disappear. They're relying on this understory to be there. This was really interesting for us. It was quite interesting for our oil palm collaborators as well, because they actually breed up these assassin bugs to release into plantations to control pests. So it turns out one of the things you can do is increase the understory and get the same benefits. Really interesting. This is a whole group of little baby Cosmolestes about to be released. We also found differences in terms of the spider communities as well. These are one of my favorite groups of spiders that you get in the plantation. I think they're completely beautiful. They're Nephila spiders, these golden orb web spiders. If you don't like spiders, these are probably your worst nightmare. They kind of hang out. They're about this size, and they hang out almost exclusively at head height. And they're really easy to miss until you but they're very important in terms of pest control. And again, one of the things we found was that over time, if the understory is reduced, their numbers decline. So again, they disappear within the plantations where the understory is removed. They've also got this really fascinating kleptoparasite associated with them. And these are little tiny spiders, you can say less than a centimeter long, that look like male Nephila, which are really tiny themselves. They're parasitic on the females, but they live in the Nephila webs and they steal the Nephila's food. And these are really abundant in plantations as well, completely fascinating. One of the things we found with those, of course, if you lose the Nephila, you also lose this other level of complexity. You lose these kleptoparasites as well. Really, really, really fun, amazing things. And we found other impacts as well. So I think there's lots of impacts above ground in terms of the predators, in terms of butterflies, in terms of dragonflies, following the trends you might expect. The same was true below ground. Work here again from Andreas Advento I mentioned before, and Adam Ashton Butt, looking at the order richness and also the abundance of soil invertebrates, seeing those drop right off as you go from enhanced plots with more understory to less to less. I know this is an entomological society talk, but I couldn't resist putting in this one as well. These are really beautiful. Those are leopard cats in the plots we work in, which is quite surprising. And we didn't really expect to see an effect of our understory treatment. It's only 150 meters by 150 meters on leopard cats, but it turns out we did, interestingly. So we got higher relative abundance of leopard cats where you've got more understory as well. These are really important for rat control and natural rat predators. They feed almost exclusively on rats within these plantations. And we think what they're doing is they're using these areas to breed. They need to have a dense understory for raising their kittens. They're fiercely beautiful and absolutely terrifying, even though they're tiny. The other thing we found was feeding this through, of course, we're understanding the whole ecosystem here, or trying to, is that this fed through to impacts on ecosystem functions as well. So thinking about those Nephila, a nice thing about these big webs is you can literally walk around a plot and you can see how many things they're catching. And over time, prey per hour drops out, prey capture rate per hectare drops down as you go from increasingly diverse understories through to the normal treatments, through to the reduced treatments. So this is impacting in terms of pest control. And that feeds through a little bit to herbivory as well. So you can pick up lower herbivory levels in the enhanced plots compared to the normal, and in the enhanced plots compared to the normal and the reduced, to do with presumably an impact of predators on herbivore control. This is interesting. It's not a huge drop here, but we weren't in a pest outbreak here. So again, one of the things that's interesting with oil palm, you get these boom and busts of pest cycles. We were talking about this with some of our colleagues earlier. But having this slightly lower level of herbivory here really could have quite a big impact when you get an outbreak. And of course, you've got lower levels of invertebrates below ground. You're also getting things like lower levels of decomposition. So it's also feeding other important ecosystem processes too. So there's this whole suite of benefits. You can kind of begin to see how an oil palm system works more or less by doing these kind of experiments. You can see how the whole thing fits together, how the system works. And interestingly, we followed this all the way through because it's agriculture. You can follow it through to yield as well. I think actually I was wrong. I think this is actually the most hideous graph in my talk. But what we're looking at here is the levels of bunch produced in these 3 different treatments over time. And you can see it's a complete mess. It goes up and down in relation to rainfall and a whole load of other things. But because we've got a long-term data set, we're able to pull that apart and basically look at whether the treatment's having an impact on yield, and they're not. So you can do all of these things. You can benefit biodiversity. You can increase ecosystem processes without impacting yield. It doesn't make these ecosystems less productive. That's really important. So of course, you don't want to do anything that would mean you need more agriculture. I'm doing all right for time. It's the last 10 minutes, we're right into, yeah. One thing we did find interestingly, again, with long-term data, is there was a negative impact. This is work, I should say, by Megan Popkin in our group, and who's been doing beautiful modeling work on a lot of this long-term yield data. And what she did find was that across the different plots, you get a negative trend between the oil palm yields and the rainfall immediately before that. We think what's going on here is basically the trees are more shaded, so they're probably fixing less oil as a result. It's quite interesting in a climate change world where we're getting more and more cloud cover in some parts of these regions. One of the things I really like about doing experimental projects or big experiments is you can nest other experiments in them as well. I haven't got time to talk about these, but I just did want to mention them. And one of the things we did, which I found really fun, we put in experimental cages, so we were able to exclude birds from little palms and look at the impacts of that on herbivory. And my favorite one, this is work from Millie Hood in our group, and also our smart tree collaborators here. You can see they're looking quite pleased because they've just finished the last setup of one of these plots, which is excluding ants for entire trees in oil palm. And she found really interesting stuff on that. So these are enormous work to put in, but she basically cropped all the surrounding trees. She was able to isolate individual palms and keep ants from coming in by burrowing in these barriers covered in grease, which stopped the ants climbing in. She really did exclude the ants. She was able to look at the impacts, therefore, on particular key parts of the ecosystem, on herbivory, on pest control, all of those kind of things. It's really interesting. I can talk to you about that if you want to afterwards, or kind of in questions. So that's my kind of overview of the BEFTA project. That's probably our biggest kind of established project, which is kind of coming to a close now. And I wanted to finish by thinking about some other aspects and moving away from just how you can manage existing ecosystems, perhaps the restoration side of things. And that's what we've been trying to do with this RERTA project, where we've been persuading, again, working the same oil palm companies to restore river margins with forest in established oil palm. This is a project we began about 4 years ago. Again, it's something we can't really do without large-scale collaboration with industry and also with lots of other researchers, both in the UK and in Indonesia and Malaysia. And what we've done here is we've basically set up replicate rivers with different restoration treatments. And these are basically different ways you could restore the systems. We've got no river margin, this is our control. And then we've got 3 different treatments, which include planting forest trees, leaving mature oil palms, which is passive restoration, or doing both, leaving mature oil palms and planting forest trees. We've got a mix of 6 different forest tree species we put in here. We've got this replicated about 400 meters long, our plots, 50 meters wide on either side of the river, and I say replicated in different rivers. Again, this is something that's come from the industry. It's one of the questions we've been asked quite a lot, is how can you best restore? As we thought, may as well test that. It'd be really interesting to find out what the benefits of this are, how ready it is, how easy it is to restore these systems. We're only, I say, 3 years in. We put our seedlings in about 3 years ago, but because we're in the tropics, the growth has been absolutely astonishing. There's an allotment, this kind of like makes me very jealous. We've managed to, you can see one of our plots here. This was all established oil palm before we started, and it's become a forest. Some of our trees are, this is out of date now, some of our trees are over 4 meters tall. Actually, they're getting up to about 6 meters now. We've had very high levels of success in terms of survival for these 6 different native trees. And the reason for that is we took advantage of a replanting schedule. The oil palm was due to be replanted anyway. And so we had the whole infrastructure of an industry to set up a big experiment for restoration. It's really interesting stuff. And we're just at the point now we're beginning to look at the impacts of that on biodiversity and indeed the spillover effects in the surrounding oil palm ecosystem. So maybe if I'm invited back in another 10 years, I'll have time to give you the results from that. The very last part of my talk, I wanted to think about some of the overarching impacts of human changes on the environment. One of the things, so most of my work up to date has been thinking about individual systems, ways you can manage tropical crops to try and make them more diverse, to harness some of the power that insects have in terms of ecosystem processes. But of course, this is all going against the backdrop of human-induced climate change. Temperatures getting warmer, extreme weather events are getting much more common. And of course, that's going to be impacting all of these different systems as well. So I'm going to whisk you away from tropical Sumatra to the equally tropical Bedfordshire and Luton, where no one can hear you scream, which is some really cracking wildlife trust sites. This is a partnership project with the Wildlife Trust Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire, where for about the last probably 15 years, been more than that, we've been working with the Wildlife Trust to look at ways they can manage their reserves for butterflies particularly. And one of the interesting things I think we've been doing is looking at how butterflies can buffer their temperatures, can control their temperatures in a whole range of different conditions. And that's sort of what's shown down here. So what we do is we catch the butterflies very quickly, we can record their length and all sorts of stuff like that. And then we use a very fine temperature probe to record their temperature. Just touch onto the thorax. You can get this done really quickly. Once you're good, you can get a butterfly measured and released in under a minute. So we do it very, very fast. And at the same time, what we do is we record the air temperature, and we also record the temperature of the substrate the butterfly was on, so microclimate temperature too. And what the results you get are things like this. So this is air temperature here versus butterfly temperature here. This black line is a one-to-one line. So if the butterfly was doing exactly what the air temperature was, all the points would be sitting on the line. What you can see here is they're generally not. They're warmer when it's cooler proportionally, and they're cooler when it's warmer proportionally. But they nearly always sit above the line. They're nearly always warming the environment. And some species, like large and small whites, are great at this. They're really good at buffering their temperature. And you've got other ones, like the beautiful Duke of Burgundy, which are completely rubbish. They get warmer and warmer the warmer it gets. So what you can do, of course, is you can bring this together and you can begin to see whether this buffering ability predicts any aspects of how well butterflies do in the environment. And that's the work that Andrew Bladen, shown here, who was a postdoc in our group, still based in the Department of Zoology, did a few years ago, brought together these large term data sets. And he was able to identify particular features about butterflies across this whole community of over 30 butterfly species, which identified whether they were good bufferers or not, if you like. And what he found was that certain families, periods, the whites were really good at buffering temperature. And also larger butterflies were always better, presumably because they were able to use their wings, sort of solar panels, and maybe be able to move around and find microclimates more effectively to cool down. The other thing we were able to do with the data, which is quite interesting, was we were able to look at their microclimate choice and their temperature buffering independently to that. Where we did that was to look at the microclimate temperature versus the air temperature. We could see how much butterflies were using that. And then the butterfly temperature versus where they were found, the microclimate temperature. And if that's different, that shows they're doing other stuff to change their temperature. So what we were able to do is basically work out whether butterflies were using microclimate or other aspects of behavior more. And across all these species, one of the things that popped out was that those species that use microclimate more are suffering more long-term. They've declined more over the last 40 years. So kind of interesting results or interesting implications for the impacts of climate change. This is a tropical talk, of course. So what we've been trying to do recently is move some of this work into the tropics. And again, I've mentioned Esme before, we can talk to in the audience, who's been doing beautiful work in collaboration with the Czech Academy of Sciences and also the Smithsonian STRI in Panama, looking at how well tropical butterflies can buffer their temperature. And really interestingly, some results here, we've found really similar results to the temperate stuff. Again, it's the periods and things like that which are coming out as being the most important. It's the larger species which are better able at buffering their temperature. So quite consistent results here between temperate studies and between tropical studies. Some of you in the audience have been thinking, oh, well, okay, fine, if they can buffer temperature, that's all right. But what does that really affect them? And, is it going to be detrimental for these things to warm up? And Esme's been looking at this as well. One of the things she's found really interestingly, I really don't like hurting insects, actually. It's a problem for an entomologist because it often involves killing lots of things. But luckily, my students really like hurting insects. And one of the things that Esme did was she put them into water baths to heat them up. And she saw how quickly they lost motor control. They dropped down, how much they're affected by hotter temperatures. And really interestingly, what she found here is beautiful work, is that species which are better able at buffering are actually more sensitive to changes in temperature as well. So there's a really interesting trade-off going there as well. So it's kind of very early results, but really interesting implications for thinking about the future impacts of climate change on this very important group. We've also been able to bring the data sets together. So this is work from Benita Laird-Hopkins, based at the Czech Academy of Sciences, and Esme again, comparing the buffering ability of tropical and temperate species across these different regions. One of the things that's come out of this, again, is it turns out there's not systematic differences in just an average butterfly and how they differ in how they can buffer their temperature between tropical and temperate regions. But because there are differences in their color and their size, what we're tending to find is across these groups, tropical species are actually a bit better than temperate species at buffering their temperature. Really interesting. Again, interesting implications. One of the things I'm really interested in then is to try and bring this work together. And I am on to the last couple of minutes now, so you can see Helen's looking anxious. And think about whether we can experimentally investigate this as well. And this is nothing, the study I wasn't involved with, it illustrates it really nicely. I'm looking at a montane area here. What you've got is a thermal camera looking at how hot the environment is, the local microclimate is across this area. It looks pretty homogeneous, the area, but what you can see is, of course, redder areas being hotter, bluer areas being colder. It's incredibly variable at the fine scale. Everyone knows that. And of course, that's one of the things these butterflies are exploiting. Of course, a lot of the studies that we've been doing in terms of understory, I mentioned this with understory, but also in terms of the riparian restoration, is actually directly manipulating the local environment, the local temperature. So one of the things we're interested in doing now, just starting up projects looking at, is how that's impacting buffering control, temperature control in these insects. Again, something that if I'm called back in 10 years' time, I can tell you a bit more about. We've been doing this in beautiful Bedfordshire as well. I was going to finish off, last thing for our experiments, and this isn't in the tropics, but I'd love to do something like this in oil palm plantations. What we're doing again is working with the Wildlife Trust, work from Matt Hayes here is also in the audience, and Esme again, but putting in experimental buffer butterfly banks, which are these large, about 14 meter by 7 meter experimental topography. We've got them in E shapes because it was meant to be sheltered and non-sheltered, looking in different directions. Pleasingly, it's also E for Ed. So I've also put my mark on these Wildlife Trust sites. Brian Eversham apparently thought they should be bees. He's the manager of the Wildlife Trust. So again, really interesting results already come out of this. And that this kind of manipulation of habitat, I think, is a really important way to go. It's thinking about how we can actually manage environments to make them more robust to the future impacts of climate change. So all of the projects I've been talking about, I've given you really a whistle-stop tour of the last 18 years of my research career, has all been really underpinned by collaboration with lots of other people. So none of that work is my own. It's all a result of collaboration with other academics, with other institutions, and with industry, and with places like the Wildlife Trust, with NGOs. And I think that's absolutely key. None of it would have been possible from the very beginning without that. So we wouldn't have been able to set up the experiments. We wouldn't have the resources, human resources, and also the financial resources to do that. The other thing is it wouldn't have been very easy to feed it back into results. So having industry involvement or NGO involvement means you can get an immediate change on the ground. If you find out something and it's convincing, that change happens. That's really powerful. We've tried to maximize on that as well. So we've had a whole lot of other publications. We don't just publish in scientific journals. We try and also publish in industry journals. I'm sure the planter is on everyone's bedside cabinet, but this is the Journal of the Oil Palm Industry. So again, we've had articles published in there because it's a really good way of getting these findings out, changing hearts and minds. We've also been able to organise exchange visits across different countries, different people working on oil palm plantations because of this oil palm infrastructure. We've had loads of school engagement activities as well, which have been really fun. This is a study tour where I think 4 different areas working on oil palm did a kind of exchange tour around our different sites a few years ago, just pre-COVID. And of course, being based in the beautiful Museum of Zoology, much more beautiful than the Natural History Museum, of course, is we've been able to, well, good response. We've been able to also link this through to our public engagement activities in the museum, which has been absolutely fantastic. So we've got a beautiful collection. We've also got a fantastic public engagement team. In particular, Sarah Steele was involved a few years ago, organising a school exchange visit where we had, visits around all of the local oil palm schools, but also a whole series of schools in Cambridgeshire, just local to us as well, exchanging pictures between schools in Indonesia and in the UK, which is really fun. And we also had an orangutan, which did a study tour with them as well and posted blogs about oil palm. Really, it should have been a praying mantis or something. I don't know why she chose an orangutan. So hopefully, just about within time, within the 45 minutes, what I've tried to do is give you an overview of some of the work we've been involved with. But I'm hoping to use this really as a showcase as to why studying the impacts of habitat change on insects is important, why understanding the impacts of management on insects is important, because there's loads of different ways that you can manage human-dominated ecosystems to still make them more diverse and indeed harness the power that insects have in terms of changing ecosystem functions. I think this is absolutely key. It's really, really important for how those systems are worked. It's really important for biodiversity. I think it's also important because it makes people think more about insects and more about biodiversity in general. I think that's ultimately what's going to make the biggest difference in terms of reducing and ultimately reversing declines in insects. And I've finished off by thinking about other ways you can do that at a much broader scale to think about how we can manage the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much for listening, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. It was perfectly timed throughout and absolutely captivating. And I think the range of systems that you described to us around the world and back in the UK, it's just been an absolute treat for everyone here to hear from you. And I think for me, some of the highlights around the BEFTA Awards, I think you would definitely get one, Ed, so that would be no doubt. We can arrange it. And hearing about the future landscapes, but also then the detail around the fungal piracy. I'm a secret fan of fungi. Maybe it's not that much of a secret, but and that was just really, really fascinating to hear as well. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we will now open up, but it's been an absolute pleasure sitting here and listening to you. So I'd like to everyone to join me in thanking you again. I'm sure that just to welcome the online audience to the room as well, it's really wonderful to have so many people online and from around the world. I'm sure I'm not going to cover every country that's represented, but Finland, Germany, Portugal, India, Ireland, and I'm sure others too. So thank you very much for joining us online, and please do use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask some questions. Yep. We'll come to all of you first. This is now your opportunity, and I'll step aside as you come back to your microphone. I just, sorry. Yeah.
Could I just ask about the meresmioid fungi? Did you say that the hyphae removed debris from the atmosphere? So how did that reduce the invertebrates? Surely it would increase it.
No, it does. That was an experiment where he removed it and then looked at the decrease, but you're exactly right. So they basically form a web, and then whenever a leaf litter lands on them, so they form a web, basically is upwards about 15 meters down to about 30 centimeters above the forest floor. And every time a bit of litter or a twig falls on it and lands, they form this little oppressorium. And when that happens, you find the rate of decomposition goes right up. Really interesting. So they just grow into them and basically decompose them. And it's that provides this habitat for invertebrates. So the work that Jake did was then to remove those and look at the impacts on above ground biomass and abundance and species richness of invertebrates. And it turns out, again, it drops right down. So having these things really bumps up the insect mass you get in a system.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So I had a question about I was really impressed at the speed at which insects came back into the plantations after you started allowing the vegetation to regrow. And of course, you'd expect the first ones to be sort of more widespread common insects. But I was wondering, do you have an intuition for the dispersal ability of some of the endemics and some idea as to how long it might go on before you might start getting endemics back into those areas?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Shall I repeat this for the online audience? Is it sorry. Okay, fantastic. Okay, it's fine. So a really, really interesting question. We're really fascinated to know that as well. So we deliberately, as I say, chose sites which aren't connected to forest. We're about 40 kilometers away from the nearest forest area. So we're really isolated. But even so, you do find things which are described in the literature as being forest specialists. It's quite interesting. Not complete endemics. There's a few species of damselfly which we found, and interestingly, they tended to be in those areas which were mature plantations. Presumably, they were hanging on after the impacts of the original clearance. So I think we're going to probably find lots of things which we haven't really seen in the landscape very much, increasing in abundance, particularly in these reforestation plots. And there's a few little hints at that already. So I should have mentioned, actually, the main project manager is Gung Ariawan, who is in one of the pictures, who's been managing the project, the RERTA project from the start, who's one of the smart tree researchers, is a great insect person amongst lots of other things. And he's noticed there's new species of assassin bugs he's not seen in the plantations before, turning up in our reforestation plots.
Oh, that's good to hear. So are you planning to continue this experiment then? So it'll go for how long? Do you have?
Well, we've got more funding for another 2 years at the moment. And we've got 2 new PhD students who've just started on it, and also Becky, who's a postdoc, who's in the audience as well, who's just started last month as well. So we're at quite an interesting time where we've got all the pre-data, and then obviously we had the pandemic. But we've sort of ticked over, and Smart Tree's been great in terms of collecting data for us. But we're at an interesting point now where the trees have really grown up, and so we're hoping to go back in and really measure what's turned up, what's changed about the system. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Jordan Cuff from Newcastle University. Thanks so much for a great talk. And I'd love to hear more about the ant exclusion side of things. But I was going to ask about the thermal buffering. So you mentioned that the taxonomic differences, particularly the families, explained some of the differences there. And that would probably imply some morphological traits might be responsible for that. And I wondered if things like color and wing shape might be factors to investigate for that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So we've kind of basically the models we've tried to parameterize those different things. So the figures, I didn't go into much detail, but they were fixing other factors constantly and then looking at the impacts of color and size independently, if you like. But essentially, we found that periods are generally very, very good at buffering. But interestingly, it's often darker color butterflies apart from that, which are doing better. So within the period, so it's a bit of a sort of contrasting result there. It's basically something about the whites themselves, which are just very good at buffering temperature. And then also the size was the big thing that came out all the way through. So yeah, no, really, really, really interesting. Some of it, we've got far more data for some families than others. We can unpick it much more with nymphalids, where we've just got more species to play with. We've gradually, so again, it's really Andrew Bladen's work, but he's set up a whole network of collaborators all over the place who've started collecting the same data. So some really interesting stuff. We've got collaborators in Czech Republic and also in Spain, a couple of different places, which are collecting the same data for same suite of butterflies in different parts of Europe, which is being really interesting. Cool, thank you.
Just one moment, but take some of the online questions. You can see before you said you've got the microphone. It might be easier if you were able to read them, Ed. Would that be
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll go through all three of those and then come back to the audience.
Brave new world. Is there anywhere nearby with intact rainforest where you compare relative abundance and richness of insects? A question from Peter Merritt. Unfortunately for our sites, there's not. There are some rainforest fragments, but on the whole, we've been trying to focus more on what you can do in an agricultural system where there's really no forest left at all. So it's not, we weren't in the whole, we were trying to move away from thinking about it as a comparison with rainforest to more with an established oil palm plantation. How can you use lessons from rainforests to benefit biodiversity within agricultural systems? But no, there's not, we're really a long way away from forest. I think it is 40 kilometers to a large intact area of forest. So it's right in the middle of oil palm central. Question from Chris Williams. With a world of human and population increase, what mix of land sharing versus land sparing would you recommend to conserve insects? Very good question, a very Cambridge-based question as well, home of land sparing and sharing. A lot of our work almost falls outside of the land sparing sharing debate, I think. So I think the evidence is pretty clear now that land sparing is better in terms of conserving global biodiversity, i.e. large, intact, big ecosystems. If you're talking about diversity, especially when it's a long tail of diversity, lots of things which are really very sensitive to human impacts, rather like those geromorpha bugs from Martina's study, conserving intact forests seems to be absolute number one thing to do. What sort of is different in terms of our work, I think is sort of, it's not conflicting with land sparing and sharing, is there's also lots of ways you can make very productive agricultural systems more diverse. And that's more in the idea of ecological intensification, ideas like that. So managing a system which is there to produce crops, but making it more diverse. So an alternative way of making high productive systems. Don't know if I answered that question. I hope I did, Chris. And then a question from Maria at the bottom. Which was the major outcome of the ant exclusion experiment from the whole mature palms? I'm glad you asked about that. So one of the things we found was that ants are dominating loads of things in these oil palm systems. So again, it's work from Millie Hood. What she found was roughly 80% of the predation we were cruel to mealworms as well. So we put out mealworms and saw how quickly they disappeared, and roughly 80% of that removal was done by ants. And it was very, very rapid. And that fed through to impacts on soil processes. It had impacts on herbivory as well. So it turns out when we manipulated those, removed ants from these systems, it turns out they're dominating loads of this different stuff. Really, really interesting.
Tilly Collins at Imperial College, and I'm actually going to ask you a human question in an entomological context. How do the people who work on the oil palm plantations feel about the enhanced biodiversity? And I have a slight interest in this, in that here we found that people complain, the people who actually work complain about increased biodiversity. Do you find that there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So we were a bit worried about that when we started as well. I mean, partly, I think, again, we were working very closely with the oil palm industry when we did this. So again, it was with an industrial plantation, but with lots of oil palm plantation research, of proper agronomic researchers. Less negative than I thought. So we were worried about people being worried about snakes and things like that. So paths were maintained. We did good hand clearance to keep the paths open for oil palm harvest and things like that. One of the things we found was the systems didn't change as dramatically as we thought they were going to. We thought we were going to get forest in a couple of years with the BEFTA project, but we didn't really. It was definitely more diverse, but it didn't really stop access to the palms. So for that project, the impact, I don't think people really minded at all. We did record that actually. We got so the crop was still being harvested by the regular oil palm workers. It's just they put the gathered fruit bunches in a different place to be counted and weighed. So it's still part of the standard industry practice. And so again, Andreas Advento, who ran that project from the Smart Tree end, had a social survey where he basically got them to score from 1 to 5 how much they liked working in the plots. And they basically don't change it. They don't change enough for them to care about it in terms of accessing the palms. So very little impact, basically.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, mention online, if you have further questions, please, we have a few more moments. You're very welcome to post them.
Hello, my name is Nick. I'm absolutely captivated by the butterfly thermoregulation. I mean, I would love to find the data and read it because I'm interested in what other factors may have been taken into account around the actual structure of the butterflies in relation to thermoregulation, for instance, like the wing scales, the color, ability to reflect long wave lights, which is heat, infrared. Has any of that been factored into that research?
So this was on the whole quite a general survey. So we looked at, we had colour in it. We were putting it into a 5-point scale, which is what was shown there. So basically lighter to darker. But of course, we do have those data. But I think you're absolutely right. I think there's loads of interesting stuff going on with reflectance as well. In particular, of course, with pale colour butterflies, they can reflect the light onto their darker bodies. They're able to use that in a really effective way to manage their temperatures. We haven't delved into it in that much detail from our own data. Some of the work that we've been collaborating with colleagues across Europe has been really interesting with this. So again, we've got a paper in review at the moment, which has been looking at the impacts across Europe in terms of colour patterns and butterflies. And it seems one of the interesting things is further south, butterflies seem to be better able to manage their temperature, warm up in cooler conditions than further north. And that's not related to a change in colours. We think that's to do with a change in irradiance, right? It's brighter conditions, which suggests they're using that reflectance power of their wings. So really, really interesting. But I think we're at quite early stage for this, really.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Robin Dill-Jones. I was interested in your E-shaped structures. And I was thinking rather larger than that, because the enormous amount of chalk being taken out of the Chilterns at each end of HS2 and elsewhere, and the extraordinary expense and huge mounds of earth and chalk which are sitting there, ripe when they're finished, to be turned into a huge experiment along the lines of even bigger E's than you've got already. In other words, 1 kilometre long on each axis.
H's, yeah. I think that's a wonderful idea. I think it's a really, really wonderful idea. It's one of those ones, again, where I'd love to have an E that you could see from space. But I think it's one of those projects where it grabs people's attention because you can see it. It's so obvious, and it gets people thinking about why climate change matters and how it can impact insects and all sorts of things like that. So I think there's a real potential ecological benefit from doing that. It's a fantastic idea, but I think it's also a great way of bringing people along. Again, I've got Matt and Esme are in the audience who've been really involved with this project. If you want to wave your hands, yeah. Who've been really running this project on the ground. And again, if you're interested in it, please do talk to them. The Wildlife Trust has been fantastic for this as well. And we've had quite a few different places, schools, and a couple of other organisations approaching us since the start of the project, only started about 1.5 years ago, asking whether they can put E's in on their land. It's really interesting, which again suggests it's one of those things that just gets an interest, I think.
One more question.
Already on
Go on a little longer, and then we'll all have to run out of the room.
Yeah, so thanks for a great talk. Really interesting tour de force of work. But I'm interested in what the feedback from the industry has been and whether or not they can actually see themselves scaling this up and what it might look like in 10 years, 15 years, whether these, it's all about low understory vegetation, whether they can ever actually see, real significant changes in the way that they plant, and whether that has to be policy driven or sort of driven by the public kind of distaste in the way palm oil's grown.
I think that's a really interesting question. So, I mean, again, one of the strengths for us has been working with the oil palm industry. So they've definitely changed their management. The plantations we work in, which is basically Cinemas, which is a subsidiary of GAR, which is, I think, the second biggest oil palm company in the world. They've changed their management as a result of doing the project with us. That's because they were involved in it, I think. Where I've not had so much impact is with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, I think, which is one of the things we're really interested to try and pursue a little bit more. And there you could potentially change perhaps aspects to do with the principles and criteria, which is how the document for the RSPO is set up. I think that's one of those things where it takes a bit of time to get to the literature and then impact change there. And I'm not sure how tractable that would be. Actually, Jane's much more involved with the RSPO than I am, and probably would be a sort of good person to talk to about that side of it. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, but I think for us, our experience has been having the industry involved has been the thing which has definitely made more of a change on the ground, at least in the plantations we're working in.
Thank you very much again, Ed. It's been absolutely wonderful presentation and a really fantastic discussion. And you were so eloquent in describing how endlessly fascinating insects are. And this has certainly been endlessly fascinating for all of us. So thank you very much. And it's my great pleasure to present the President's Medal to you. No, I know you shouldn't block out the ladybird, but and thank you all for being a wonderful audience. It's wonderful to be back in person, and it's just been fantastic to see so many people. And I'll just go back to the very early mention of, if you're not already a member of the Royal Entomological Society, we'd be delighted for you to join, and I hope you'll consider that. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Ed.